Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to reintroduce to you now. Amber O'Hearn is a returning guest on our show. Be sure to check out her first appearance on episode 90 of Boundless Body Radio and her second appearance on episode 301, all about low-carbohydrate diets and sleep, which is one of our most talked about episodes of all time. Canadian-born Amber O'Hearn is a data scientist by profession with a background in mathematics, computer science, linguistics, and psychology. Amber has been studying and eating low-carbohydrate diets of some form or another for the last 25 years, the last half of which has been specifically the carnivore diet, which she helped bring into modern awareness by giving the first conference talks on the diet in 2017, organizing the first carnivore conference in 2019, and writing the first scientific paper with the title Carnivore Diet in the title in 2020. As such, she has unique insight into the history of this trend and the common pitfalls of new adopters and influencers. Amber is a free speech maximalist and an advocate of privacy enhancing and censorship resistant technologies. Amber lives on the other side of the hill from us in Boulder, Colorado. You can find Amber on her website at www.mostly.fat.com. Amber O'Hearn, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you back to Boundless Body Radio.
Thank you, and thank you for that kind introduction.
It's such a joy to welcome you back. I'm so glad you agreed to be on our show way back on episode 90 when we were first getting started. Since then, I've been able to run into you at several different conferences, including this last one in 2024 at the COSI conference that was hosted by Dave Feldman in Las Vegas, which was amazing. You were a presenter there. I hadn't actually seen you present at a conference in quite a while. And I just have to say that presentation was quite the mic drop. You did an amazing job at that presentation. So I just wanted to tell you, amazing job doing that presentation. It was great.
Thank you so much. It was actually kind of intimidating for me to talk about more of a personal history, but that's what Dave wanted to hear about. And so I'm glad it went over well.
It definitely went over well. Everybody that I talked to really enjoyed that and kind of reminded us that you're still out there doing tons of work in this space, which is amazing. How did you find that conference? I know it's been several months now, so maybe a bit of a challenge to reflect back on, but how did you find that conference? What did you think of it?
Oh, it was great. I really liked that it was kind of a smaller setting than some of the other conferences, and everybody who was there seemed to be really engaged. There was a single track, and even the vendors were in the same room with us, so they got to see all the presentations. It just had a really energized vibe that I hadn't seen for a long time, and I love the way Dave Feldman is not married to one particular paradigm, and so you can really see that in the attitudes of the people that he brings together.
Yeah, definitely. Did that feel like the first time that conference had ever been done, or did you feel like that was like a well-established conference that had been going for like 10 years?
Oh, I mean, it didn't feel like there were any newbie kind of glitches. It was very professional. Yeah, it absolutely matched or exceeded the expectations that I would have had from the other conferences in this area I've been going to.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I guess we couldn't expect much less from Dave Feldman, but what a great job on his very first conference. And I absolutely love the confluence of what I noticed of you had so many people interested in cholesterol and the questions about LDL cholesterol and everything that we're trying to chase down as far as information as to whether that's, harmful for people on low carbohydrate diets, and also the mental health aspect. People that are forced into this type of a way of eating, very ketogenic, therapeutically ketogenic or even no carb carnivore diets due to mental health. And then they have to grapple with this fact that they might be dealing with very high cholesterol and wondering whether that's actually an issue. I thought the confluence of those two things was such a strong theme and so interesting to not only hear from experts, but also talk to people who are dealing with that in the real world and how difficult that is to grapple with.
Yeah, it's very real when it comes to a contentious health idea that you have to confront personally when you do something that you can tell is helping your health, but has this one big flag that the rest of the world is not really on board with a particular interpretation of, or even most of the people in the world think that it might be dangerous. And Dave has absolutely, of course, moved the needle on the science around that spectacularly. At that conference, he even had Matt Budoff come briefly to talk about where the study that he's organized is. We're all on the edge of our seats waiting, and it's too bad that these things take such a long time. But I think, if he hadn't been behind it with a fire under everybody, we would be still 10 years out from anything remotely like that, at least.
Yeah, totally. The Budoff conversation, I mean, you could hear a pin drop in that room when he was talking. I thought it was absolutely amazing. And he's not necessarily a low carbohydrate guy. He's just the one
No.
doing that study. And to sit next to my friend Robin Dobbins, who's dealt with bipolar for most of her life, fixed all of it with a carnivore diet, and not just talking about her and her life and the decisions that she has to make with her own diet, but asking her husband, Matt Dobbins, on the podcast, like, would you trade one day of your wife eating this way and not dealing with the symptoms of bipolar, but also knowing that she's a lean mass hyperresponder and has cholesterol through the roof? And most doctors would tell her that she's going to die any minute of a heart attack. And having him say, I would not trade one single day of that risk of having a heart attack based on the conventional wisdom around cholesterol and LDL cholesterol in particular, versus the experience that I get to have with my wife every day, being present and her enjoying her life, not being basically sedated by medications, to me is just like such a ground level, personal kind of example of why these questions matter so much.
Yeah, I mean, anyone I think who's struggled with psychiatric disorders knows how absolutely devastating they are for not just the life and dreams of the individual who is embodying them, but everybody around them. And, I think Michaela Peterson has said if she had to choose between which effect of the carnivore diet, the one on her arthritis or the one on her mood, she had to give up. She said, absolutely she would keep the mood, because it's just so much more important than anything else when you don't have your mood and your stability of mind in place, and nothing else matters.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I mean, that's exactly why I stayed on a carnivore diet after doing my 30-day experiment back in April of 2019. I can list off 20 or 30 things that are better now. I've never spent a day sick in my life. I haven't missed one single session of all my personal training sessions since 2019. But the one thing I can say is, like, the day that I realized my anxiety kind of dropped out and I was able to deal with stressful situations in a way that I couldn't comprehend before. It's like, we've used this example of like driving in the fog. When you're in the fog, you don't really realize you're in it until it clears up and you see better visibility. It goes away. You don't realize what you're dealing with. I would say the same thing. Like, that's the reason that 5.5 years later, I'm still on the same thing, because the anxiety that I was dealing with, I don't want to go back to that. It's not worth, eating delicious carbohydrates to go back to it when I just feel so much better without that anxiety.
You're here.
Awesome. Well, speaking of carnivore diets, you have gone through quite the journey with the carnivore diet. It's been a while since you've been on the show. So if you don't mind, can you share with us a little bit of your kind of journey through carnivore diets, and even some things that you've learned recently with a bit of a reintroduction with carbohydrates successfully in your own diet and with people that you coach and work with? Can you describe that journey for us today?
Sure, yeah. I don't coach people. I just don't feel like I have a lot of expertise in the subject matter, but when it comes to people, I think what people need is someone who understands the challenges that they're going through psychologically and socially. And very often the people who come for coaching are those who have complicated medical situations that I just felt I didn't have the resources to address.
Fair point.
But in my own life, I don't know how much we went into this last time we talked, and I don't want to be too repetitive, but as you know, and as maybe some of your listeners know, and maybe some don't, in the end of 2018, I went through a very bad gut infection that caused post-infectious IBS for years to come. And it took me a very long time to get out of the mess that put me in, because it caused fat malabsorption and chronic diarrhea, which was and I didn't realize it at first, and I don't know how I could have not realized it, but it started causing many deficiencies because I wasn't able to absorb the nutrients that I was eating. So even though I continued to eat the carnivore diet, that, like you, I spent 8 years not getting a single cold or flu or anything, even though I had young
Wow.
children in school, and even though I was used to getting 1 or 2 illnesses of that type a year. It was just like I felt I felt invulnerable, but it was all toppled over by this severe salmonella case that I had, and it took me years to get out from under that. So one of the things that happened in my recovery is that one dose of starch sort of seemed to have broken the cycle of the chronic diarrhea. And after I had had a serving of potatoes, almost all of the problems that I was having were about like 80 to 90% resolved within just a day. And that
Wow.
was so interesting to me. I thought, well, maybe I need to be eating starch on an ongoing basis. I tried that. It didn't give me any extra benefit, such that when I stopped it, I wasn't any worse off than while eating it. And of course, starches are not as amenable to the lifestyle that I wanted to get back to, and to the weight loss that I was hoping to get back from the weight gain that I experienced during that post-infectious period. So I stopped eating them. But since then, I've done a few different forays into trying more plants and more carbohydrates on a few different occasions. One of them was eating just rice, not for more than a couple days at a time. I found that this didn't seem to disturb my mood. So that's information. Which is unlike certain kinds of vegetables, which I've tried in the past, things like garlic and onion, or things that seem fairly innocuous can actually have a bad effect on my mood. I also did some experimentation on doing a vitamin A elimination diet because I've long had a blog post in the works, like really ridiculously long. I started writing it in 2019 about how I think carnivore dieters might be particularly susceptible to hypervitaminosis A. And that's why, that may be why a carnivore diet of the tradition that I first encountered and that I started when I started a carnivore diet was, we weren't against eating organs exactly, but it was not emphasized, and most of the people in it were just eating muscle meat. And it was fascinating that that was okay, because obviously, even though the RDAs can be met with animal foods, they're not going to be met on a daily basis if you don't include high amounts of liver. But what I was finding through the years is that people who did include enough liver to cover RDA bases couldn't stay on the carnivore diet, didn't feel as well, or would even just downright say this diet doesn't work. So I was really fascinated by that, and I came across Brent Jenner's work in, I guess, the beginning of 2019. And Matt Stone, another blogger, had written a blog post about how he had noticed that the carnivore diet, in the way that I'm talking about it, with the traditional carnivore group from ZIOH who are eating primarily muscle meat, was actually a very low vitamin A diet. And he suggested that maybe the reason the carnivore diet works so well is that it's actually a vitamin A elimination diet. And because this topic has grown immensely in popularity over the past, say, 2 years, I wanted to know if I could add back specifically. I'd never tried adding back specifically vegetables that were both low carb and low in vitamin A. There are almost none of them. Basically, it has to be white. So like artichoke hearts. I feel like there's one other, hearts of palm or something like that. There's almost no other things. So I I optimized my diet for a period to have only carnivore foods that are not high in vitamin A, so no dairy and no eggs, and definitely no liver or anything like that. And added back some very low vitamin A plants to see if this would be beneficial for me. And I actually think it did have some benefit, which is a little bit complicated to explain. But it definitely caused me to gain weight. And I didn't have that same sensation of what I feel like when I feel like I'm on a carnivore diet and everything's working properly. I didn't get to there. So briefly about the benefit, and I promise I will follow up with more detail about this later, but here's a little preview. I have been suffering for the past couple years with what I thought initially, and it still might be, I suppose, is some kind of a hot flash related to menopause. I'm postmenopausal now, and so since last time I talked to you, I think that's a change actually. And I started having these flashes of heat that would come over me and last about maybe 2 minutes. And during the course of that, it would be like a whole body flush and almost a tingling sensation, but also energy would completely crash. Sometimes this has happened to me in the middle of a tango dance, for example, and I'm just like, I've got to finish out this dance. But if I wasn't there, if I was at home, I would basically like lie on the floor and try to cool off and wait for my energy to return. And at
Wow.
a peak of that, it was happening like 12 times a day. It was just so disruptive. And I couldn't figure out what was happening. I tried different like bioidentical hormones that my medical professional was giving me, and they didn't have any effect on it. And the one amazing thing that this vitamin A elimination diet, and I have to say it wasn't only an elimination, I also took a set of supplements that specifically I had reason to believe could help flush out vitamin A. Within a week, I didn't even notice. I suddenly, like a week later, it was kind of like when I started the carnivore diet. Suddenly, at some point later, I was like, wait a minute, what happened to such and such a symptom? I suddenly
Yeah.
realized I had none of this. Um, and I think that it may be attributable to vitamin A, but it may also be attributable to something else like acetaldehyde, which could have its origin in either a fungal infection or some kind of histamine sensitivity. So I don't want to say necessarily that eliminating vitamin A per se caused that benefit, but definitely doing a vitamin A elimination protocol caused that benefit. And so that's something I'm eager to write about more on my blog. And it was an interesting experience that I had, even though I was eating some plant material.
Wow. Yeah, that's fascinating. It's such an interesting topic, and you do see a lot of people in our community who are, in my opinion, and probably yours as well, way over consuming things like organ meats. And they seem to have issues where other people who, kind of like yourself, have been in this community for so long, just don't really seem to have a problem when they're just consuming regular meat that they get at the store. And it doesn't really seem to be a problem with that. You mentioned something interesting about bringing in carbohydrates and helping the issue by doing that. It seems like, I don't know, do you find that people who are very strict on a carnivore diet could be benefited by like intermittently bringing in some carbohydrates some of the time? It doesn't sound like the effects are that great. Like, I know for me, when I bring them in, I experience my anxiety comes back, my sleep kind of sucks, I have cravings again. It lasts for like a day and a half. It's not the worst, it's not the best, so I don't choose to do it very often. But you also hear about other benefits of doing it periodically. Do you think the exchange is worth it for most people who are doing mostly a carnivore diet?
I think mostly not, actually. I think if you have some specific thing going on and the carnivore diet isn't feeling amazing to you, there may be more of a reasoning for trying something like that and a potential for getting a benefit somehow. But for someone who's just coasting along, doing awesome on a carnivore diet, like it sounds like you are, and like I have experienced in the past, I see only downsides to doing that. Like you said, like getting cravings, disrupting things. Um, you can always get a kind of more glucose-based metabolism burst by doing higher protein and sort of, I know some people who alternate, for example, between higher protein phases and lower protein, higher fat phases and seem to get benefit. And so maybe that does argue for a benefit of doing a more cyclical type of diet. And certainly I think that there are kinds of carbohydrates that are less harmful to people than others. And I would, at least in my personal experiences, seem to show that starches in particular that are very like white, having very few other bioactive chemicals in them, seem to be particularly safe. I can't believe I'm saying this because I was so against the safe starch movement many years ago. Paul Gem and I used to talk about safe starches, and rice was the one that he was particularly in favor of. But I would really hesitate to say that it's the kind of thing that would be necessary for sustaining a carnivore diet, just because I know so many people who have needed no such intervention, and I don't really see any logical reason for it either.
Gotcha. That's fascinating. You mentioned the fat and protein, and I consider you one of the absolute experts in helping us understand how much fat to protein we need as far as a ratio goes. I'm wondering how your thinking around that has evolved over time, and how you're currently thinking about how much fat, how much protein, and how we decide when we're out of balance and what we need to add in or subtract.
Oh, that's a good way of phrasing it. I mean, the original carnivore diet uh, that I was doing and that the people I was with were doing was not macro based, really. What we would find, we would tell people to eat fatty meat, but in practice, that would often look like something like around 70% fat and 30% protein. And I think 30% protein is about as high as you start to get before it becomes too much, if you're eating enough, that is. And I was really compelled by how many people were getting such incredible benefits, and almost all of us had come from a low carb diet already. So it's not like we went from a sad diet to a carnivore diet and started getting all these benefits. So I was surprised because the low carb diet seemed to be getting its benefits from being particularly ketogenic, and moving to a diet of only meat where the proportion was very often a lot higher. Like you imagine somebody who's on a low carb diet and they're eating a lot of, say, salad and oil or avocados or foods that are higher fat than they are protein, and a lot of fiber. And so it tends to be more ketogenic. And then they move to a carnivore diet, which is only mildly ketogenic if you're doing it at that level of protein. And yet people were still getting immense benefits. And so for a long time, I thought, wow, the ketosis piece is important. I know it is, but it's not the only thing that's important. And maybe it's not even the most important thing about a carnivore diet, because people are being less ketogenic and yet they're getting more benefits. But then the longer I was in that community, the more I found that there were some people who would not get that same level of benefit unless they were much more careful about their macronutrients. And so then, as you know, I started doing more of a deep dive into what happens if you restrict your food choices in the same way that a carnivore diet does, but you do pay attention to this macronutrient level, and you reduce your protein and add fat. And it's not even about ad libitum eating, because at first I thought, well, when you eat ad libitum, you're just naturally going to eat a lot more protein. And I think if you try to make the ratio be like 2 to 1, for example, fat to protein, and you just eat as much meat as you want and then add fat on top, it's always going to feel like a struggle. But if you start, and Siobhan Huggins did a really great post on this, fat first eating. If you start with eating something that's almost pure fat or that's already at a 2 to 1 ratio, you start naturally getting satiation and satiety with a lower level of protein. And so that can also start to lock in, sort of in the same way that when you start a low carb diet, you might initially have to consciously not eat more carbohydrates, but once you've got your new metabolic state going, you no longer crave the carbohydrates. And in a similar way, I've noticed that people who try this higher fat, lower protein approach, at first it may be difficult and you want more protein, but then it sets itself up in its own metabolic state. And that seems to have worked a lot for people, especially who have a protein sensitivity for some reason or other. Sometimes it's from a diabetic history, and some, I don't even know what all the reasons are. And so how you know to adjust, I think a lot of it can be done intuitively. I know even when I was straight up carnivore and not trying to lower protein, I would still go through phases where, wow, I really want the fattiest ribeye that I can find in the store. And I'm going to eat my portion, and I'm going to eat half of my husband's portion before I'm going to be satiated at that meal. And then sometimes I would just have phases where I just really want the leaner piece and I don't want as much. And I learned to just put trust into my intuitions about that, and that mostly served me very, very well.
Yeah, interesting. I wouldn't be too happy if I was your husband and you were eating my portion of steak, though. I just have to say I'd be pretty pissed off about that. Well, that's really interesting, and I think I'm kind of with you as far as like the best way to answer that question. Like fat to protein, how do you know? Honestly, I do think it's the intuition. Like I always keep on hand ribeyes, and I also keep on hand New Yorks. And the New Yorks that I get are a little bit leaner, and you can kind of cut the fat cap off if you want. And I never really know, like going into the afternoon, what I'm going to want. But inevitably, I get to the afternoon and decide, like, oh, this one looks really good. That one doesn't look as good. The next day, it might be completely backwards. And, some days I'll cook it in butter, and other days I don't want to cook it in butter. I just want it straight up. And so, do you find that as long as you're setting fences around what you consider food and it's mostly carnivore, that is the best way to be intuitive about your eating and just decide what sounds the best and let your body kind of dictate the level of fat or protein that you need that day?
I think that's absolutely the best way to approach it, unless you're trying to move to the more ketogenic version, in which case, like I said, you might need a few days to adjust to the lower protein intake before it starts to feel natural to you.
Yeah, gotcha. How bad does that answer suck for somebody like you who's so scientifically minded and is an expert in mathematics and computer science to have to say at the end of the day, we don't know, you have to be intuitive about it? Is that hard to come to that conclusion?
Well, it's quite a relief. I mean, I would like to free up as much bandwidth for thinking and planning for other things in my life. And when things just work out, and when when I don't have to use my prefrontal cortex to figure out what to eat, it's actually quite liberating.
That's a good point. I love that. Okay, awesome. I want to continue our conversation from last time where we talked a little bit about low carbohydrate diets and, in particular, the effect on sleep. And this was a topic that was so fascinating to you. You started taking classes again, which I understand you're doing now again as well. I would love to hear how that has kind of evolved. How did your interest in low carbohydrate diets and the effect of sleep start to kind of grab you as something that you wanted to explore?
Yeah, well, I had been interested in sleep science for quite a while, and so I was taking a course on sleep and the physiology and neurobiology of it. And I wanted to when I took that course, and that was in 21, I really wanted to revisit all the sleep science that I had studied on my own, but also make sure I was getting a thorough understanding. That's why I was taking a graduate level course. And I wanted to revisit it in light of all of the neurobiology that I'd sort of passively picked up over the years by studying the neuroprotective effects of ketogenic diets. So when I first started doing that, I didn't really know what BDNF was. I didn't know all these different pathways. And so every new paper was a trail of things to look up so that I could understand the paper I was reading. And over the course of years, it turned out I had learned a lot. So I wanted to integrate that with sleep, in part because I looked at various websites and papers to try to find out what the current knowledge was on the effect of ketogenic diets on sleep, and found that the literature was very, very limited. And not only that, but there were blog posts out by people who were experts in sleep, but not on ketogenic diets, who made understandable, but also sort of egregious assumptions about the ketogenic diet and how it would affect sleep. So for example, they would say things like, well, here's what we know what high fat diets do to sleep. So a ketogenic diet is a high fat diet, so that's what it does. And of course, a high fat diet with high carbohydrates is metabolically completely different from a high fat diet with low carbs. And very often when you look at the literature and to see what happens with a high fat diet, you will find the opposite results in that study from what happens when you also remove the carbohydrates. So I really wanted to be able to do the most careful and expansive literature review I could do on what was out there, by first getting more expertise in sleep and then connecting it to the knowledge that I already had. And so that's what the result of that was, what the paper that we talked about last time on the therapeutic properties, where I talked about how a ketogenic metabolism will increase slow wave sleep, for example, by increasing the intensity of the delta wave in the slow wave sleep part. But of course, through all of the extra readings that I was doing on sleep and connecting it, I had much more than that review paper worth of things to say. And I started noticing the connections between just metabolism and energy itself. And there's a whole literature, well, small whole literature on the pathways, the common pathways between sleep and energy. And so I wanted to do a paper more directly about that. And also, well, also, I'll say also, which is one of these problems that I keep running into, is that I try to do too many things at once. I really wanted this paper to be a synthesis of so many different things. And one thing that I've learned, or that I know and maybe haven't fully learned, is that people can usually only get one idea at a time. And if you write a paper and you try to introduce 3 separate ideas and argue for all 3 of them, it becomes a mess. It's hard to follow. And it's less compelling than it would have been if you had stuck to one and did that really well. So I I did end up cutting some sections from this paper that were included an evolutionary story about how sleep, how high-fat diets may have contributed to the species differences in sleep in humans and other primates. I left that out for another day. But what I did keep in here that is really 2 things at once is the idea that satiation is behind the difference between losing weight on ketogenic diets and losing weight on calorie restriction. And I know lots of people like Gary Taubes have tried to describe this in the past, and there's a certain proportion of people who will say, oh, I get it. And completely turn around the perspective of how they're looking at stuff. But then there's another subset of people who have still not really appreciated the fact that when you say that a ketogenic diet has these advantages in weight loss, it's not, we're not saying that the calories disappear, or that you can't at the end do a calculation and say, see, the calories that you used added up to the calories that went away. Nobody is saying that that's not the truth, but it's more about the causal processes and what happens when you do one versus the other. And so I used this paper about the commonalities between energy and sleep to show what happens when you take natural satiation. And natural satiation means you have eaten to energy adequacy. And when you have energy adequacy, then you can clearly see specific pathways in sleep and metabolism that will not pop out if you don't have energy adequacy, even if you're talking about the same kind of metabolism. So there's that conflation of starvation with ketogenic diets, or if you have weight loss. So there's a lot there, and it's hard for me to summarize in one paragraph because I deliberately put in a lot.
No surprise there. Yeah, that's really well explained. And you kind of have already alluded to what satiation is. But for somebody who wants to dig a little deeper and wants to understand what is satiation like practically speaking, how are you able to explain what that feels like to most people who probably have very little life lived experience living with satiation?
Great, I love that question. So let's talk about what it is and then what it feels like. So what it is, and I'm going to distinguish it from what I think the literature calls appetite. And appetite can have in it a mixture of things that can cause people to want to eat. And when I use the word satiation, I'm trying to isolate out the physiological factors only. So, from a behavioral standpoint, and especially if you're using non-human animals, you can't really say, is somebody satiated or not? All you can say is, did they stop eating or not? and when it's a human, there are all these complex motivations and beliefs. So I might stop eating because I'm late for a meeting, or I might stop eating because I believe that if I stop eating at this amount of portion, that's going to cause me health benefits, or, a variety of other things. So what I want to just focus in on is stopping eating exactly because you got the sensation that you don't need anymore, you don't want anymore. You've lost interest in eating the food. And I would also like to not to factor out the situation where you've lost interest in the food because it's not palatable, or because you can't stand another bite of this dried chicken breast or something like that. Like that to me isn't satiation, even though technically it would cause you to stop eating. One experiment that was really exciting for me, that made me think about it differently, was from Nicolaitis and Evans. And what they did was they were able, and I don't know how they did this, and I've got to find out exactly how this works, but they claimed to be able to separate out the metabolic rate in the animals that they were studying that was coming from locomotor activity versus metabolic rate that's basal. And what they noticed was, if they look at only the basal metabolic rate, there's a period of time which they're eating, and then they stop, and gradually after a bit of time, the basal metabolic rate starts to drop. And when it drops enough, the animals will start eating. And as soon as they start eating, basal metabolic rate starts to come back. And when it reaches that baseline again, they stop eating. And that was very compelling to me because it was so clear from the data that this effect had to be causally related to their starting and stopping eating, and therefore to be the satiation factor. And I also loved it because metabolic rate itself is very directly the kind of thing that you want to know about whether your body has enough energy. I mean, at base, if you say you eat, the reason why organisms eat is to get enough energy. That's very obvious in retrospect, but because it's so hard to measure that we have enough energy, we're stuck with things like, oh, do they have, ghrelin, or is there glucose floating around in their bloodstream? And things like that can be good, like, proxies to a certain extent of whether you're experiencing hunger or whether you have energy available. But having glucose in the bloodstream, as everyone knows, is not the same as actually oxidizing glucose and getting ATP out. And it's only when you can get ATP that you can actually say that you've got energy, and metabolic rate is a much more direct measure of that. So I mentioned that study in the paper, and I also talked about one other measure of energy production, which is reactive oxygen species, ROS, and how I think that that measure may be the most accurate and universal one that we have for whether we're getting enough energy, because many of the other proposed or sort of close proxies that we have work if you're talking about a glucose-based metabolism, but don't work if you're talking about a fat-based metabolism, and in fact may make it look like you're hungry or out of energy on a fat-based metabolism, even if you're actually not. Whereas ROS is sort of substrate agnostic in that way, and that makes it a really good tool. So what that feels like, I think, can be different in different contexts. For most people, in most cases, it's sort of a soft boundary. Like, you have your plate, you're eating, you have the sensation that you had enough. It's not a sensation like, oh, my stomach feels awful, if I put another bite in there, it's going to hurt. That's like fullness. And it's not, I don't know, it's not necessarily really acute in a painful kind of sense to do with your stomach or anything like that. But it's just the sensation that, oh, I don't really want this. I don't have the eagerness toward it I had when I sat down. And then if it's soft and you don't have a lot left on your plate, you might be able to eat a little bit past it and feel okay. But sometimes I've experienced this only on the carnivore diet, had never experienced this in the first, I don't know, 40 years of my life probably. And I know most people haven't experienced it at all, but I sometimes, especially when I'm eating very high fat, will get this very sudden onset, very clear, I like to call it a force field boundary. It's like I can't lift that fork and put it in my mouth because I'm just done. And it's not nausea, it's not that kind of discomfort. It's just a very firm sensation that I don't want to eat anymore, even if there's just one bite left on my plate and I have to throw it out otherwise. I don't know if you've experienced that, Casey, have you?
Absolutely, almost on a nightly basis. So frustrating because you'll get to like one or two more bites. It's delicious. It was delicious 30 seconds ago. I want to save it. I don't want to like give it to my dogs every night. I want to like eat it myself. But a force field is probably the best way I've ever heard it described. It's like it's an aversion to something again that like 30 seconds ago was amazing, and now I cannot even bring the fork to my mouth. That's a really good way of explaining it. I really like the way you explain that. And you're right, like so few people understand the difference between satiety, the way you're describing it, and what I think most people understand as fullness. Go ahead and eat a salad that has some chicken in it. You're going to have that for lunch. You'll have some oil on it, whatever. You'll eat it. You will be full. But 2 or 3 hours later, you'll be so starving after eating that meal. That's not satiety. That's a totally different thing. So I'm glad you differentiated those two things.
Yeah, thanks. I think if you've experienced it, those words will definitely fit with what you've experienced. But if you haven't, maybe it sounds really weird. About the eating the salad or getting to fullness, I think that a lot of people have been taught, especially if they're trying to control their weight, that it's really important to pay super close attention to your sensations while you're eating. And as soon as you get to this will do for now, to stop eating. Whereas the carnivore um, rule of thumb around it has always been actually the opposite. Like eat until you unambiguously can't anymore, rather than until you could stop eating if you wanted to.
Yeah.
And I think you can't really fool the body. Like, for one thing, if you eat a little bit more, and let's take for granted right now the idea that metabolic rate is really the determining factor, your metabolic rate is just going to be raised for that much longer. It's going to be either that much longer before you start eating again, or if you have a scheduled dinner coming up, you're going to reach the satiation on that next meal that much sooner. And it has to work out. And on the other side of that, your metabolic rate is within some bounds. It's not like exactly the same every time. So if you consistently eat a little bit less than to get where you wanted to be, your metabolic rate adjusts down. And if you eat consistently a little bit more than where you needed to get to stop being hungry, your metabolic rate will adjust up in a healthy person. And that's why, like, it doesn't matter that you can't calculate calories to the exact 10 calories or something like that, because your body it's a living thing that adjusts. It's not, it doesn't need this rigid thing the way a gas tank would.
Yeah, that's so well explained. The whole reason I found ketogenic and eventually carnivore diets to begin with was spending over a decade working on a metabolic cart and trying to assess people's resting or basal metabolic rates, and understanding that that number was so dynamic, and the person that was cold all the time and had cravings was over dieting, usually overdoing the cardio, trying to burn too much energy. Like, you see that compensation where their bodies are naturally burning less calories, and the way to recover that for a lot of people, it's not very comfortable. It's not very fun. But when you start eating more, overfeeding that person, like initially, like maybe even like hamburgers and milkshakes or whatever, again, it's not very comfortable. They're going to gain weight. But eventually the
Yeah.
metabolic rate speeds up and causes the opposite effect, where their weight control can then come back down because you get that overcompensation. It's just we have such a short-sighted way of looking at calories in, calories out, and thinking it's this math equation without realizing that the inputs are constantly changing the outputs. So you're dealing with a moving target. Your metabolism is never the same based on what you eat today changes the formula for tomorrow. So yeah, I like the way that you explain that as well.
Yeah, I think it is one of the saddest things sometimes to see people chasing the lower and lower calories, and people get stuck down at these really low levels, and they feel trapped because they know if I eat more, I'm going to gain weight. And it takes a lot of courage to be already weighing more than you want to, or to feel that you're ideal even, and to know that if you do what you need to do for recovery, it's going to cause you to be even fatter for a little while,
Yep.
and to put your trust in that. But that's one of the things that I really loved about the original carnivore movement too, is not only was this emphasis on eating more rather than eating less. A lot of people who came to that community at that time were people who were struggling with weight and had a history of chronic caloric restriction. And many people we saw initially gained weight and then started to lose it, but a lot of people who started to experience that could not bear it. It was too scary. And I get it. I understand. And a lot of people left or went back to some kind of hybrid carnivore foods with caloric restriction thing that I think ultimately is not going to get them to the place in health where they need to be.
Yeah, I agree. It's totally understandable. The heaviest I ever got in my life followed a period of very high stress. I was under eating. I got my body fat down to single digits, the lowest I'd ever seen it. And I was freezing cold and had terrible energy and had to recover it. And gaining 20, 30 pounds was really uncomfortable. I had to buy new pants, in fact, like over a decade ago when I was doing that. But that caused eventually my metabolic rate to come back up and my weight to come back down eventually. So again, I get why people would not want to do that, but it is, in my opinion as well, like the best thing that a lot of people can do for health if they're in that particular state. And I did want to tie this kind of back to sleep as we're talking about satiety. I know in your paper you talk about common kind of pathways between satiety and sleep. Are you able to talk about like what those things are and how those two things are related?
Yeah, just briefly, I mean, there's a correlation between having a lot of energy and the duration of sleep. And it's more subtle than that, but that's the basic correlation. So if you have people who chronically do not have enough energy, and you will see this in people who are fasting too much or just fasting enough, but are doing it for a short period and they're going to get this result, or people who have anorexia and are just chronically not eating enough. What happens is that their sleep is shortened and they may especially be affected in the latter half of the night where they're constantly waking or they wake up really early and can't get back to sleep. And on the other hand, if you are overeating or gaining weight, the duration of sleep seems to prolong. And what I found out was that because because a ketogenic diet can give you either high energy or low energy, some of the literature, which is already sparse, as I mentioned, is often conflating a ketogenic fat-based metabolism with this under-eating condition. However, the ketogenic condition can cause slow wave sleep to become more efficient and take less time. So you can get actually a slight compression of sleep time, even with adequate energy. That's a different pattern from having not enough ability to stay asleep in the morning, but you're just getting such efficient slow wave sleep with a high altitude, high amplitude delta waves, that you are more rested with less sleep, which is one of the ways that the correlation can break down a little bit. So sometimes I hear from people who try a ketogenic diet and they say, I love this diet and it's really helping me lose weight, but I can't sleep. It's disturbing my sleep. And that's where the message comes in that if you're not eating adequate energy, first of all, the sleep problem is a symptom of that. It's telling you something. But second of all, it might not be getting you the results you want for weight loss either, because as I tried to explain in the paper, if you've got, say your basal metabolic rate is about 2,000 calories a day, and you know that from some average you've taken, and you say, well, I'm going to eat 500 calories less per day, and that's going to force my body to use up 500 calories worth of fat. Well, the fact is it doesn't force your body to do that. Your body's going to release as much fat as it can to make up that deficit. But if it can only provide 300 calories based on rate limits of how much you can release or how much you can burn or some other thing that's going on in your body, you're just going to have to make do with 200 calories worth of energy less that day. And so you don't get the deficit that you're counting on getting. Whereas if you eat ad libitum and you've gotten satiety, what's happening in a ketogenic diet is that your insulin levels are dropping and you're naturally starting to burn more fat all the time that affects your energy production such that you get hungry later for less long, just naturally. And when you do it that way, you know that those calories were made up because you're not feeling hungry and you're not losing sleep.
Mm. Wow, that's so fascinating. So, what do you tell the person who complains to you about that phenomenon? They're feeling great, they're on a ketogenic diet, they're waking up at 3 in the morning. I get this all the time. I'm waking up at 3 in the morning, I can't go back to sleep. This is terrible. What do you tell that person when you maybe like probe into them and ask, like, well, do you still feel tired during the day? Are you taking naps the way you used to? Like, it sounds like you're full of energy during the day. What do you tell the person that's super frustrated because it seems like they're not able to sleep as long as they would like?
Yes, so there's definitely, that's an important point. Like if you ask them, if they say they're getting less sleep, but they feel fantastic, then that seems to indicate that they've tapped into more efficient sleep. But if they say I'm getting less sleep and I'm a wreck, then obviously they're losing sleep that they actually needed. And what I usually ask them is if they're restricting calories, if they're getting enough fat, and sometimes I suggest eating a small, high energy meal is maybe not the right word, but I hate the word snack too, but just eat a small amount of something high in energy closer to bedtime. And often people, not always, but often people will say that that solves it for them. It just keeps that satiation and the energy availability going longer when maybe they weren't able to access it from their own fat stores all the way through the night.
Yeah, that's great advice. I like to point out to people that like you have just been gifted with an extra like 2 or 3 hours of daylight where you needed to sleep such a longer amount of time. Now everything that you've wanted more hours to do what you need to do in a day. You now have that. As long as you're not feeling completely sapped of energy, you feel really good. This is great. This is exactly what you wanted. You can be productive with your day and do a little bit more than you otherwise would have. It's almost I get the same thing when people say I started carnivore and I'm really constipated, and you dial in a little bit and say like, are you constipated or are you just not going to the bathroom as often as you were before? And
Right.
people are like, well, yeah, I guess I'm not really noticing any symptoms of constipation. I just haven't pooped in like 2 or 3 days. And it's like, well, that's just your body using what it needs and not really needing to do that any more than is necessary because you cut everything else out.
Right. Really good distinction.
Yeah. Okay. This is super interesting. I think a lot of people will have a lot of value in this. Tell us a little bit about what is on your horizon, anything that you're working on, or any particular interest that we can look forward to learning about in the future.
Oh, well, one thing that I have started, and I started it a couple months ago, but it's really feels like it's barely off the ground. I opened a forum called Well Actually. Um, it's well-actually.fyi, but it's not a free forum. It costs $5 a month to join. And I've really hesitated for years and years and years to charge anyone for anything because I really, most of what I want is for people to get information. But one of the primary reasons I decided to put a subscription cost on the forum is to help um, filter out people who aren't very serious and who are just trolling. And I found that the quality of the people, the members that we have is really good. The conversation level is really high, and I'm excited about taking that further. I've been blogging. I'm I've got some blog posts coming up about different types of fasting, especially in light of this satiation piece. And also the vitamin A post that I've promised for 5 years is getting closer to done. So those are the things I've been working on.
Always very, very busy. I absolutely love your blog. Tell us a little bit about what somebody could expect from the Well Actually. Like, what kinds of topics are you exploring there? Is it along the same kind of veins?
Yes, about so I for a long time, and this group still exists. I have a group on Facebook called Keto AF, which was originally a joke name about
So good.
ketogenic animal foods, which is that high fat, lower protein version of carnivore. And the Facebook group, it's really slow because I am an absolute taskmaster. I won't let people post without it being moderated, and it's just too much work for me for a very slow amount of participation. And so one of the reasons I opened the forum in the first place is I wanted to have a place that I could feel more confident about moderating less heavily and still having people talk. So there's a whole keto AF kind of conversation going on, but people are also talking about like saturated fat and more like even high carb kinds of dietary experimentation. There are people talking about vitamin A. There are people doing critiques of books and literature that are out there, all kinds of different things going on.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, you're always taking on so much and trying to share so much. And so I think it's a great idea to have a small fee to join that group. So that's amazing and have access to what you have available. Amber, I always just really enjoy the time that I get to spend with you. I'm very fortunate to consider you a friend and have gotten to spend a little bit of time with you in person at some of these conferences. And I just really appreciate all the education that you are seeking and also seeking to share with your followers and our listeners. It's really very much appreciated. For now, where can people go to find you and connect with you and your work?
Thank you. I really love talking to you too. This has been good. All of our conversations were just so satisfying. Um, I think the best place to find me if you want to actually interact with me is Twitter. I'm very responsive to answering questions as long as they're good faith questions. I don't always see notifications because the software doesn't always show me, but if I see it, I will answer. And if I didn't answer, I probably didn't see it, so try again.
That's awesome. We will definitely link to that in the show notes and also link to your awesome blog and your latest project. So thank you again, Amber. It's such a joy to chat with you, and I just really appreciate our time with you. So thank you so very much for everything that you go out and learn and again share with others. So thank you so very much for all of your hard work, and thank you for taking time to be on our show today. Again, we really appreciate you.
Thank you. Likewise.
Of course. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.